Welcome to the Backyard Professor Responds videos. The Wallstreet Journal has recently produced a really ridiculous trash hit piece article full of lies and manipulations against the entire UFO narrative that is quite frankly ridiculous. And none other than Richard Dolan has taken a very close investigative look into the claims of this Wallstreet Journal article. It is behind a paywall. One of his patrons got the article for him, and he's made comments. I have not seen the article. I have watched Richard's response, his masterful analysis of the abject stupidity that the Wallstreet Journal assumes exists in American minds. However, there is a sinister aspect to this article, what I would view as a sinister aspect, and that is who is the target audience of this Wallstreet Journal article. Dolan appears to believe that it is Congress itself, and I agree with him, because the Wallstreet Journal, being part of the establishment narrative, has got to not investigate the issue, but to squelch it. And that's what it's attempting to do. I'm not going to share the entire article, but in support of my friend Richard Dolan, and in support of the petition which I have already signed and which Richard presents, given with the New Paradigm Institute, I want to share my analysis, my ideas, my reaction to Richard's analysis. I won't share the whole thing, but there are some significant pointers here. The reason this is worth addressing, many in the comments have already said, well, who listens to the Wallstreet Journal anyway? Unfortunately, there are still millions. And they will believe this cock and bull story that the Wallstreet Journal has put out. Dolan does not, and he step by step, systematically and calmly, entirely dismantles its idiot logic and its ridiculous lack of historical context in one of the best takedowns that I have ever seen or heard. And so I want to give my support to this idea that, and I have been saying this in my own videos. I said it again. I was invited to Mike and Dave's Multiverse show tonight, where I appeared as their guest, and we talked about this. We, the American public, are being brainwashed, not into believing UFOs, of which there is plenty of credible evidence, but we are being brainwashed and dumbed down into believing what the idiots at the Wallstreet Journal and our U.S. government says about the proof that there are no UFOs. And that's what we need to fight against. They are not only hiding the truth, they are winning the battle. And this comes just before Congress is set yet again to get more investigative power going into this UAP phenomenon in the up and coming weeks. And we need to support our Congress. The Wallstreet Journal is trying to apparently shame the Congress into not investigating anything whatsoever. And this is sophomoric amateur hour as far as credibility and proper use of sources. Let's take a look at Richard Dolan for a minute.
Greetings. Last week, the Wallstreet Journal, actually, I think 4 days ago, the Wallstreet Journal, that paragon of the establishment, published the first part of what we are told is going to be a two-part series, or maybe a multi-part series, but I think two. It is a pretty strong take on the subject of UFOs, a really strong take, actually. This is the top of the article. It's behind a paywall. I was able to read it because some very nice person, a member of my website, provided me with the whole article, so I was able to read it. I'll link to the article, but you're going to need to find a way to get to that. If someone here has the article, they want to paste it in a comment, hey, I'm not going to complain, but that's up to you. But I do want to talk about this. So this is called the Pentagon Disinformation That Fueled America's UFO Mythology. It's by Joel Schechtman and Aruna Viswanatha. They've written pieces for the journal before, and also which have touched upon UFOs, all in, not surprisingly, a very skeptical tone throughout. But the central thesis of this piece is very, very interesting, is that really much, maybe all, most of the United States' modern belief in UFOs, and particularly claims involving crashed saucers, reverse engineering programs, and government cover-ups, all of that, this did not originate from real encounters or from actual alien technology, but rather it originated from intentional disinformation campaigns conducted by the Pentagon during the Cold War and beyond. So yes, they were trying to make you believe in aliens.
Does this just not smack of desperation? Sincerely. So now we're being told that the government that has been so concerned militarily, as well as with the Pentagon and with the CIA and the DOD and the DOJ, etc., they've spent tens of millions of dollars, and they've been very, very concerned with this issue of the UFOs. There have been numerous books by former military and or government people who have written on this at the end of their lives. And all of this is just make-believe because they wanted us to believe a fake story. And this in order to throw off their enemies. And the interesting thing is the assumption, and unfortunately they might prove correct, is that we American public are stupid enough to believe this crock and bull. Millions still do. But unfortunately, history and the evidence is not on the Wall Street Journal's side.
All right, well, before I continue, let me just remind you, if you like this video, please do share it, subscribe to my channel, all of that. So the article it references a number of previously undisclosed interviews with more than, I think, 24 current and former national security officials, as well as, it says, thousands of pages of internal documents. So according to the authors, the sources indicate that for decades, the U.S. military and especially the Air Force actively spread false information about UFOs to protect classified weapons programs. So there are a number of key examples here. One of them involves a former Air Force colonel in the 1980s. We do not know this man's name. He reportedly handed over doctored photographs of flying saucers to a civilian bar owner near Area 51. These photos were intended to distract public attention away from experimental aircraft being tested at the base. And the article really makes a case like this was not an isolated event. This was actually part of a larger pattern of strategic deception. There's another element of the article that talks about what is described as institutional hazing, essentially, within the classified military programs. They called it Yankee Blue. So they had multiple unnamed sources, all of them are unnamed. We're told that new personnel in certain black programs were sometimes misled into believing that they were being inducted into secret alien technology retrieval efforts. So the article basically claims that this contributed to the persistent rumors within military circles, within intelligence circles, about non-human craft, about reverse engineering efforts, and then these rumors eventually leaked into public discourse. So that's basically that argument. They also revisited the famous 1967 Malmstrom Air Force Base incident. This is when nuclear missiles were shut down in one way or another, apparently, and I would say, as far as the evidence and testimony goes, during a UFO encounter. Some people say it was something else that caused that. And in fact, this article does say something else caused that. It offers a totally new explanation. And it says that the malfunction of these missiles, there were quite a few of them, was caused by an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, test that was conducted by the U.S. government itself. So the U.S. knocked its own missiles out. It wasn't some unknown craft, but the U.S. did an EMP test, basically as a test to see whether like a nuclear blast would knock out the missile. So rather than detonate a nuclear weapon, they detonated an equal EMP blast that would equal that of a nuclear explosion, essentially. And so that's what they're saying. So that was the true cause of the incident, according to the article. And there's more. I mean, the article basically just maintains that all of this propagation of UFO stories and lore served several important functions for the military. First, it misled foreign adversaries about American capabilities. It helped to hide the existence of classified aircraft. It gave cover for different types of sensitive national security operations. So it did not explicitly deny all unexplained aerial sightings. I wouldn't say it went that far, but it did very strongly suggest that the mythology, and that's one of the words they use here, surrounding UFOs, and especially the idea of recovered alien craft and all the secret government knowledge, all of this was deliberately fabricated by American officials for strategic reasons.
Now, to me, this is critically important because we find in the comments to several of our videos, when we attempt to describe the reality of the UFO phenomenon, and we discuss various authors and the research that they have written about in their books, we find so many people just saying, oh no, it's just a psyops operation. It's all fake. There are no UFOs. There are no orbs. There are no real craft. And anyone who writes a book is just a grifter. But it is precisely the careful analysis of genuine declassified historical documents, whether those are government or military, that demonstrates that they are, in fact, quite real. Because these declassified documents were never designed to be seen by the public. It was very, very private information between very high-ranking officials, militarily and governmentally, that they were telling the truth between each other. And their concern was this verity of the UFOs. This isn't a narrative invented, as this idiotic Wall Street Journal pretends. This was a genuine concern of a reality of which our military and our government could not control. And it is through the research efforts put together into books, documentaries, films, and on YouTube channels that we now are able to discreetly and cleverly and truly discriminate the truth from the false in this Wall Street Journal, and the entire thing is pure baloney. It wants you to believe the UFOs are fake, and it miserably fails, as Dolan will show. Let's keep watching.
They also drew on some recent reports, like the 2024 Arrow report, to support their idea that there's no credible evidence of non-human tech or evidence of a cover-up by the government. They argue that many of these aspects of the UFO narrative originated as part of a Cold War disinformation strategy that has now taken on a life of its own in the public imagination. That's basically the thesis. You might be able to get a copy of the article. So there's a couple of revealing things about this article. One thing I just think needs to be pointed out here relating to the Wall Street Journal in general. From 2017 onward, as the UFO or now UAP story gained momentum, really starting in December of that year, I mean, we had Navy pilots speaking out, we had Congress starting to launch inquiries. If you go back over the Wall Street Journal's pieces, I mean, mostly they remained on the sidelines. They did engage occasionally in this subject, and when they did, it was usually with a very skeptical reporting, some occasionally, I would say, snarky editorials. What you never found with the Journal, or really with any of these mainstream publications, the legacy media, is a genuine curiosity or what you might consider investigative depth. That was never the case with the Wall Street Journal. They had a very clear tone, very distant, very dismissive, and always aligned with official narratives. And that's really what we all have come to expect with the Wall Street Journal. It is one of the main pillars of the establishment. So in that sense, this latest article is not a departure at all. But I would say it feels more like a culmination. You've had years of skepticism. So the Journal did not shift to inquiry. No, they doubled down on their already chosen position on this.
And this is a very critical point that Richard Dolan's own books and research shows the difference between his analysis and his sources that he used that the Wall Street Journal pretends don't even exist. They never even mentioned them. And the basis of the reality of the UFOs, which Richard Dolan's research has demonstrated time and time and time again. The reality of which the government officials and the military officials all accepted and were discussing privately in very top secret documents that are now declassified so we can see them. They were trying to discuss how on earth are we going to handle this? We can't even keep up with them. They have a technology vastly superior to us. It's a danger. And it wasn't only the United States who was concerned with this. That's what else the Wall Street Journal entirely ignored.
I think what's different with this article is the scale and the intensity of what they're really saying here. This is a complete attempt to recast the entire modern UFO narrative as deliberate Pentagon disinformation. So it's a continuation of the same attitude, but it's louder, maybe. And as I'm going to suggest, it's a much more strategic expression of the position that they've held all along. But first, before I get into that, I want to break down the article just a little bit more. So this piece is billed as like a bombshell. But the thing is, once you step back and really examine it, it reveals much more about the intent of the article and the authors than it does about the UFOs that it's claiming to explain. So let's start with the sourcing. They reference thousands of pages of documents and interviews with 24 current and former officials. Okay, that sounds impressive, but the article actually offers no documents, no specific declassified reports, and very few names at all. Most of the claims rest on anonymous sources or really very vague anecdotes. For example, we are told that Air Force officers staged these elaborate hazing rituals to convince their own colleagues that UFO crash retrieval programs were real.
And again, Richard doesn't do this, but I will. The fundamental difference and the reason why that authors who write books are not grifters is seen very clearly in, say, Ryan Wood's book, Magic Eyes Only, where he documents 104 specific cases where inside government agencies discuss and explain the UFOs, the alien bodies, etc. And he lists specific names, specific places, specific kinds of strategies, and very specific documents throughout his 600-page well-documented text. Richard Dolan, the national security state. I bought his second volume at Contact in the Desert. Dolan also has a 600-page tome documenting with very specific names, their rankings, which department they were in, what subjects they were talking about, because he is also utilizing declassified documents that were never intended to be seen by the public. So they're actually discussing what their legitimate concerns were, and those concerns was the reality of this superior technology from a non-human source from another world getting into the hands of their enemies. So it was critical for the military to keep this secret, not because it's a fake narrative, but because it's very real. And Dolan likewise gives very specific names, institutions, people who were talking to people, their rank in the military, their rank in the government, their every bit of detailed information, the names of the documents, who wrote what to who and when, what the year was, what the month was, how big the document was, who signed this, who signed that, what were the assignments, what were the restrictions. Dolan goes into exquisite detail in what I can only term is a proper investigation, as has Ryan Wood, as has another author, Alan Steinfeld, in his book, Making Contact, as has Whitley Strieber in several of his books, as has Linda Moulton Howe, as has so many UFO researchers. None of this detail is in the Wall Street Journal, but it assures us that there are thousands of pages of documents that show this was all just fake, which is exactly opposite of the historical reality as we have meticulously documented in authors in their valid research. This is the value of having the books and reading them. People who will just dismiss authors as grifters trying to make money entirely remain ignorant and susceptible to the tripe that the Wall Street Journal presents.
First of all, it sounds really bizarre. But the story really never explains how or why you have multiple generations of military and intelligence insiders across decades and across agencies, why they would all share the same narrative of reverse engineered technology. That's not a prank. That is a pattern. And then there's the whole framing of the article. From the very first paragraph, you get this very dismissive tone. Sightings are reduced to costumed conferences in Las Vegas. They treat concerned whistleblowers like basically dupes. The whole history of UFOs is reimagined as this Cold War psyop. So basically, you, the reader, you're told there's nothing to see here. This is just all a clever misdirection. And yeah, you should be a little embarrassed for having believed it all. But then really what's the most glaring thing to me is what the article leaves out. There's no mention of the Navy videos confirmed by the Pentagon. There's no reference to pilot testimony from people like David Fravor. There's no acknowledgement of radar data or the public and the classified congressional briefings that have taken place over the last 7 now years, because none of that fits the narrative, so they just exclude it. And even the Arrow report that came out in 2024 and was cited in the article as a kind of final word gets the same treatment. It's summarized, it's not quoted, it's referenced. It is not, there's no interrogation of that report in the least. So there's no nuance. All the public criticisms from former insiders of the Arrow report, all of that is ignored as well. Really, when you look at this article, this is not an actual investigation, which it is billed at. This is a reframing effort. It is really a part of informational warfare. It's not trying to solve the mystery of UFOs. What it is trying to do is bury it, and replacing it with a story that just lets all the institutions off the hook.
This is so critical, and it is exactly why I got into this entire UFO phenomenon issue on YouTube, is because I want to find out what's real. Now, in order to find out what's real, I have always advocated looking at all sides. So I agree we have to read junk stuff like this Wallstreet Journal, but just because it's printed doesn't mean it's true. The thing we need to do with our critical thinking apparatus that has been so dumbed down by just these types of idiots running the national presses and the national newspapers is we need to see where the sources are. We need to see who is writing the sources. We need to read those sources. And the best place to get those is from UFO authors such as Richard Dolan, Ryan Wood, Linda Moulton Howe, the Tedesco brothers. They now have entered this narrative because they too have direct machine analysis, radar, they have infrared, they have all types of instrumentation analyzing the anomalies in the sky, demonstrating without a question we are dealing with a physical fundamental reality out there that the official narrative wants us to be ashamed of looking into, when in fact it's where the evidence lies. That's fascinating. One more brief clip from Richard Dolan. This entire video is worth watching. I can't do it justice. What I'm doing is I'm letting you, my audience, know this is worth watching over and over again so that we can, what we're seeing Richard Dolan do is apply critical analysis to a junk tripe article that is supposed to be a serious analysis of the UFO phenomenon. You can see what critical thinking shows. I've advocated this since the very beginning, which is why I always advocate, rather than thinking everyone who writes books as mere grifters, which would fall in line with this main narrative journalistic junk that they keep feeding us, we apply our critical thinking skills and test their claims through an historical analysis. The power of historical analysis now, in light of this Wallstreet Journal, is exquisitely obvious. Through a historical context, we can see the bullshit that the Wallstreet Journal is feeding us, as well as those who claim this is just a government psyops. We have the historical evidence showing that you've been brainwashed and you're deceived. Those of us who believe in the UFO phenomenon have the historical evidence. this is critically interesting. One more quick idea from my friend Richard Dolan.
That's the real takeaway that I get from this. This is less about uncovering the truth. It's much more about managing perception. Mythology was manufactured, and we've created this new story here. That it's all over. There's no mystery left, and all the institutions should face no further scrutiny as well. So that's not journalism, my friends. That is damage control, really. So I want to step back a little bit more, and I want to look a little more critically at this claim made by the Journal. What you really see is this is just a neat little story that collapses even under the most modest scrutiny. For starters, there have been hundreds of thousands, millions maybe, of UFO sightings since the 1940s. The National UFO Reporting Center alone, one of my favorite websites, has more than 100,000 sightings that they've collected. The MUFON database is countless more, and around the world there's just so many others. So to say that the U.S. government invented UFOs to cloak black projects ignores another problem, which is the very extensive and real concern that this phenomenon has triggered within the highest levels of military and intelligence organizations for decades. In fact, for an entire human lifetime. You go all the way back to the late 1940s. You have the U.S. Air Force, you have the CIA, the FBI, the Navy, later the NSA. All of them have taken UFOs seriously. In 1952 alone, you had such a spike in sightings, including over the nation's capital, that the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence initiated their own internal investigation, resulting in one of the most remarkable memos that I've become aware of in the declassified literature from scientific director H. Marshall Chadwell of the CIA to the director of the CIA, Walter Beadle Smith, where he says these sightings of unusual objects over sensitive installations at such altitudes and speeds are not attributable to normal natural phenomenon or known types of aerial vehicles. It's a pretty straightforward statement there. So, and then you have by 1953, the Robertson panel convenes, not to debunk sightings based on fact, but to manage public perception and to discourage civilian interest. That is not the behavior of an agency unconcerned with reality. That's the behavior of a government threatened by a phenomenon that it could not control. And it's the behavior of a government that sought to minimize UFO reality, UFO consciousness, not to heighten it, as this Wallstreet Journal article maintains. And this is a pattern that you see for decades. You have generals, you have defense analysts, you have presidents talking privately and occasionally publicly about their concern. You had Edward Ruppelt, he was the first head of Project Blue Book, talked about craft with capabilities beyond anything we could conceive. That's a quote in his book. Is that part of the disinformation program, Wall Street Journal guys? You have CIA documents repeatedly discussing the need to monitor UFO reports as potential indicators of Soviet or even non-human technology. The documents are all there. And then you look globally. And, again, the Wall Street Journal article makes no mention, none, of the international character of this phenomenon, which is quite astonishing because you cannot understand UFOs without going global. The Soviet Union maintained one of the world's most comprehensive state-sponsored UFO programs. From the 1960s through the 1980s, you had Soviet military and scientific institutions studying incidents involving disc-shaped craft, electromagnetic interference, interactions with nuclear facilities, just like many of the cases that we get here in the U.S. So that's the Soviet concern. In France, the National Space Agency has maintained a dedicated UFO unit, GAPAN, for over 40 years. In the UK, you had the former Ministry of Defense officials like Nick Pope publicly attesting to the seriousness with which some of these cases were treated. Even China, Brazil have all, and many other countries have had waves of sightings involving structured craft tracked by radar, seen by trained observers, and all of that. So you cannot chalk that up to some Pentagon psyop. These are sovereign nations, often adversarial to the U.S., running their own investigations completely outside the framework work of American disinformation. So to claim, as the Wall Street Journal does, that UFOs are a myth invented by U.S. military deception, it's not just historically inaccurate, it's intellectually lazy. It dismisses the depth of the military concern, all the scope of the evidence, and the sheer global consistency of this phenomenon. So it's not fantasy. This is reality, and has been recognized quietly by many of the world's most powerful institutions. So when you have to ask, like, why was this article so over the top? Like, why would these writers go so far? Like, if you're reading this as a serious researcher, you have to be asking that. Like, why frame the entire modern history of UFOs, the crash retrievals, the whistleblower accounts, all the persistent leaks? You're going to label all of that as a product of an elaborate disinfo campaign or pranks and some kind of Cold War, sleight of hand? The sheer scope of the claims of this article, it's almost theatrical. Like, we're being told that multiple generations of these professionals were fooled or manipulated or complicit in this sprawling hoax that somehow escaped correction until now. Until now. So you really have to ask yourself, like, I'm supposed to believe that what looks like a consistent signal across history is really just institutional noise that they created. From a researcher standpoint, this is a very curious and I would say mystifying argument that you would make. It's so unbelievably weak that you wonder who is this designed for? What is this? Who is this being written for? Because the tone, the timing, and the framing suggests to me that this article is not aimed at the general public at all. This was not a story meant to inform. This was a message, and it was a message meant to reassure someone. And to understand that, we really need to look at who that someone is. That someone is Congress. This article did not land in a vacuum. This article arrived just as lawmakers are preparing for another potential vote on the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Disclosure Act, that is, the UAPDA. This legislation was first attempted in 2023. It was shut down totally. It passed a little bit in 2024. Basically, it was stripped out of a lot of its provisions. So it got passed in a truncated form. It's not dead. And in fact, there is every reason to believe that it will be brought back for reconsideration. Probably, I'm going to say, as soon as this fall. And if it passes in full, this act will change the landscape permanently. And I am quite convinced this is why you're seeing a sudden push to discredit the entire premise of UFOs happening now. This is about shaping the narrative before that vote.
I think he's put his finger on the pulse. I think he's entirely accurate because of what's still occurring. They want to keep Congress in the dark. They're trying to shame our Congress from checking into it. And this is why we as the public need to be concerned. This is why we as the public need to be involved. And this is especially why we as the public need to take our brains back out of the brainwash that this Wall Street Journal narrative and our government has stamped upon us, and we have accepted like sheep. We need to begin to think for ourselves and study for ourselves the actual research, the actual documents, the actual narrative. And that is why I advocate to stop calling the authors of these books mere names. Get off your lazy butts and study these books first before you dare call these authors just mere grifters, those of you who are doing that, because you're possessed of the lazy narrative virus. And if you're too lazy to do your own research, then nothing you say means anything to the rest of us who are doing our research and advocating for what is real. Because if you think the books aren't worth pursuing, then you have nothing to contribute to this narrative. You are simply unbelievable, and we have every right to simply ignore you. The naysayers, you need to do your homework first. Refute the narratives that Ryan Woods and Richard Dolan and Tracy Dolan and Alan Steinfeld and Linda Moulton Howe refute their historical narratives that they have presented in their texts that were genuine, top secret classified documents that have now been declassified. Show me how Richard Dolan's analysis of this Wall Street Journal is wrong. That would be my first challenge. I'm not going to share the whole narrative with you. I've shared enough to show you that there is something seriously amiss in this whole narrative. And what is amiss is the critical thinking. What goes on too far and too much is the labeling of genuine researchers as just grifters. They are not. They are the truth tellers. And I side with them.